Welcome everybody on the 2020 Women and Gender keynote lecture. My name is Dorottya Sallai. I'm an assistant professorial lecturer at the management department at the London School of Economics and the chair of the Women and Gender Forum. I would like to thank SASE and especially Nitsan and the SASE organizing team for making this lecture today possible. I have the honor and pleasure to welcome and introduce our guest today. Professor Stephanie Barrientos, who is Professor of Global Development at the Global Development Institute at the University of Manchester. Professor Barrientos has researched and published widely on gender, agribusiness, and employment in global value chains, trade and labor standards, corporate social responsibility, fair and ethical trade. She has undertaken research in Africa, Asia, Latin America, and Europe. She led research commissioned by Cadbury titled Mapping Sustainable Cocoa Production in Ghana and India, which informed the Mondelez Cocoa Life program. She has advised a large number of companies, NGOs, governments, and international organizations, including Body Shop, Cadbury, Marks and Spencer's, Nike, Oxfam, the ILO, among many others. Professor Barrientos held the Leverhulme Major Research Fellowship between 2013 and 16 to write a book, which she will partially talk about today, titled Gender and Work in Global Value Chains, Capturing the Gains, published by Cambridge University Press in 2019. She is research lead on the DFID program, Work and Opportunities for Women in Global Value Chains. She also leads a GCRF ECRC research project, Shifting South on Decent Work in Regional Value Chains in Africa. The title of her lecture is Gender and Work in Global Value Chains, Forwards or Backwards in the Era of COVID-19. Thank you, Stephanie, very much for accepting our invitation. It is a real pleasure to have you here tonight, or today, whatever is your time zone. We will now listen to the presentation, and we will have around 15 minutes at the end for discussion and questions. To make the most of the limited time that we have for the discussion, I would like to ask the audience to please post your questions during the presentation in the Q&A box. Only the Q&A box, please. And we will aim to answer as many questions as possible after the lecture. So thank you very much. And without further ado, I would like to give the floor to Stephanie.
Hello, it's great to be with you, and I'd like to thank the President of SASE and the Women and Gender Forum for the invitation to give this lecture. It's a great privilege to be amongst so many academics and researchers whose work I've long admired and also have been a great inspiration for my work. I'm also very sorry that we can't be together. I always love attending SASE conferences, all the discussion, the debates, the engagement, but hopefully this virtual session will at least allow us to continue our discussions in these very challenging times. What I'm going to focus on today are two parts. Firstly, I'm going to talk about gender and work in global value chains, really drawing on many years of research, which is synthesized in my book of the same title, Gender and Work in Global Value Chains. And here I want to just briefly summarize some of my key arguments about the way in which women workers especially have been drawn into paid work in value chains, what the commercial and social implications of that are, and the implications for them. But also, very importantly, I want to draw on new and more recent research, which I've been involved in relation to the implications of coronavirus, particularly for women workers, and which really raises serious questions about whether the challenges which we face are going to lead to serious backward movements or forward movements for all workers, but particularly for women. Firstly, just to contextualize what we mean about global value chains and the dynamics and trends in global value chains. There's been a big expansion in the growth of trade through global value chains since the late 1970s and into the 80s. And this is trade that's largely coordinated by lead firms rather than simply through traditional market intermediaries. It's estimated that trade through value chains has reached around the late 2008, after the financial crisis, somewhere between 55 to 80% of world trade, depending on how value chains are estimated. And there are quite different data and estimates provided by the World Bank and by UNCTAD. There are some indications as well that trade through global value chains peaked around the financial crisis, and there's been some decline. But as we'll see, there's no doubt that coronavirus has really hit global value chain, the movement of goods through global value chains. The first of my work is largely on retail value chains, and the key retailers are the big players such as Walmart, which is the largest brick and mortar retailer in the world. Walmart operates in approximately 28 countries. It sources from over 90 countries globally, and it has an annual revenue approximately the equivalent of the GDP of Switzerland. But there are many, many other very large North American and European retailers. But it's really important to remember that retail firms, dominant retail firms coordinating global value chains, are also growing very rapidly in Africa, Asia, and Latin America. An example here is ShopRite, which operates in 14 countries across sub-Saharan Africa. Another very big change taking place in the whole retail sector, and certainly coronavirus has played an important role in driving this and augmenting it, has been the growth of online retail and distribution platforms. The most famous, of course, is Amazon, which is one of the largest companies in the world now, but also in China, Alibaba plays a very, very similar role and is very large across Asia. But again, don't forget that in other parts of the world, online retail is also growing. For example, in Africa, Jumia, a Nigerian company, is the #1, advertises itself as the #1 African online retailer. Retail has led to significant employment, and women are over 50% of workers in virtually all retail, direct employees in all retail shops and retail companies. And so women play a kind of key role, but not only as employees, also very importantly as customers. It's estimated that over 70% of retail purchases are undertaken by women. And therefore the leading retailers are quite gender focused, particularly at the consumer end, because they know they need to appeal to women as customers and as consumers if they want to maximize their market share. Moving further down the value chain, the key to all retail is sourcing from multiple countries. As I mentioned, Walmart sources from over 90 countries in the world. But a key argument in my book, it has been that the expansion of retail, modern retail, is really based on the commercialization of household work which has traditionally been undertaken in the home, usually unpaid, by women, and that much or parts of that work have now been brought into the commercial sector, and women have been brought in to undertake that work. So therefore, the paid work of women is linked up with the commercialization of work which has traditionally been undertaken by them. And this two key examples of this are garments, ready-made garments, which were traditionally made, repaired within the home, are now produced in very large factories. It's estimated that over 60 million workers in the garment sector, approximately 70% of those are women. But also very important to remember that there are the different tiers of the value chain, and that the lower tiers, particularly in informal work, home-based work, all the embellishment that goes into the production of ready-made garments is often done, the majority of it is undertaken by women in the home and in informal employment. Another obvious example is processing and the preparation of food. Women have traditionally been the main, been heavily involved in preparation of food within the home. As that's been commercialized, women have been brought into the value chain, both at the upper tiers in terms of packing and processing of food, but also a lot of food is sourced and continues to be sourced from smallholder farmers as well as larger commercial farms, and women play a key role in smallholder farming. They're often not recognized as the farmer because they're not don't have access to the land tenure, but still they play a critical role in the actual production of food. In terms of actual data and numbers, there is what I would call invisible women workers in global value chains. The data overall is pretty poor. There is an estimate which can be found in the ILO that publications that for 40 OECD and middle income countries, approximately 400 million plus workers are employed. 42% of those are female. But the problem with this data is it excludes lower income countries, it excludes lower value chain tiers, casual workers, informal and unpaid, family labour who don't enter into labour market statistics. And we know that a lot of the sourcing through value chains is done through subcontracting and outsourcing to these lower income countries, particularly labour intensive production, such as garments and quite a lot of food. Some examples, therefore, will be of data come largely from industry estimates and from case studies. So these are helpful, but they're partial. They don't give you that aggregate figure. So, for example, China garments, we know there are 5 million workers, wage workers, approximately 80% of those are female. Bangladesh, 4 million workers in garments, somewhere around 60 to 70% of those are female. And if we go through to more traditional types of agricultural products, we know that West Africa cocoa, there are 1.5 million smallholder farmers. 25% of those are women. These are women who are recognized as the land owners, but approximately 45% of the work is undertaken by female labor. And there's a big debate, particularly in academia, but also elsewhere, about whether this work is empowering or disempowering for women workers, which is something that I will explore more in a minute. Thinking through analytically how we analyze value chains, this work really draws on the work of people like Gary Gireffi and many other collaborators on global value chain analysis. In its very simple form, a value chain links all stages of production from inputs through the production, distribution, retail, through to the final consumer. And this is coordinated by lead firms, by the large retailers and brands who govern the train. A key dimension, though, of value chains, which is really, really critical, particularly, I think, from the gender perspective, is that what the lead firms do is they outsource all aspects of production that involve risk and costs. So the risks and costs are pushed down the chain to suppliers, and they retain for themselves the more value enhancing activities and the more value capture activities, and particularly at the consumer end of the chain through marketing and other roles that they play. But, and this is a very, very important but, quality matters in global value chains. There might be constant pressure for lower prices, pushing prices down and costs down at supplier level, but quality matters. And quality is attained through a range of different standards: product standards, environmental standards, and social standards. And women workers play a key role in the just-in-time production of goods to meet the very demanding and exacting requirements of the big retailers in order to keep the costs down, but at the same produce quality goods that can meet the standards. And drawing on a combination of global value chain analysis, global production network analysis, and feminist political economy really helps to examine not only the commercial dimension, but how value chains are embedded in local labour markets. And within those local labour markets, there is an interaction between the actual labour market participation, the paid work, and unpaid reproductive work, which is largely undertaken by women. And flexible female labour, especially, it blurs the gender boundaries, I would argue, between the more traditional standard labour market and these reproductive activities as women move out, in and out of paid and unpaid work. Extending this further, in the book I developed the analysis of global reproduction networks to really understand further the interaction between the commercial and the societal dynamics. Here I'll just briefly summarise my arguments. Essentially what I argue is that gender inequality is really systemic in global value chains, and it's systemic at a number of levels. Firstly, as I've said, the expansion of retail value chains especially is based on the commercialization of social reproduction of activities undertaken in the home. But this is based on very significant power asymmetries which themselves are gendered. And those power asymmetries are both commercial, between lead firms who have a monopoly and suppliers who are often beholden to them, and societal, based on gender division of labour between men and women, in which women are largely socially have played a more subordinate role and have been more repressed. Now, how those power asymmetries play out in the value chain is, I would argue, highly gendered. Value extraction by the lead firms is key to the commercial dynamics of a value chain. This can take place through three forms. Firstly, it's value creation, simply the production of goods that have value. And as we've seen, certainly in labour-intensive retail value chains, women often play a key role in producing goods which they've traditionally produced, but often on low wages with low levels of remuneration. So therefore they create value, but the remuneration, the pay, etc. is low. The second key dimension, though, is value enhancement. It's not simply creating the good, but it's also ensuring that good has high quality. And in terms of attaining quality and enhancing value, women's skills are very, very important. Those are societally, socially acquired skills, as the work of Elson and Pearson has long shown, but they again are not fully recognised, particularly the intangible skills that lead to products looking nice, being environmentally and socially well produced. And women are not sufficiently remunerated for their contribution to the enhancement of value. So that, therefore, those two facilitate value capture by the large lead firms who use their commercial power to put pressure on suppliers, to drive down costs, drive down risk, and get the more profitable activities at their end of the chain. But a key argument as well in relation to the commercial dynamic and the societal dynamic and how those interact is that there are contested articulations between the commercial and the societal. What value chains do is they open up the opportunity, particularly for paid workers, paid women workers, many of whom have traditionally not been in the paid sections of the labour market, to contest their engagement. And that can be done individually, simply through exit, through better workers leaving, finding new jobs, labour turnover. It can also be through collective, through workers being part of trade unions or worker organisations, and especially where the women workers are represented, those can also have an important gender impact. But also, very importantly, collaborative contestation. Because global value chains link the buyers through to suppliers, pressure can be put not only on the suppliers themselves for poor working conditions and poor practices, but also on the buyers. And collaboration between NGOs, trade unions, civil society organisations is really an important form of leverage which can be used to pressure buyers to make improvements. So therefore, in relation to this debate over whether paid employment in global value chains is empowering or disempowering, a lot, I would argue, depends on the levels of contestation. It also depends on the commercial dynamics of the value chains themselves. And here there's been a lot of work in value chain analysis around the concepts of downgrading and upgrading. I focus more on economic upgrading is moving to higher value activities, social upgrading, moving to a higher, better, decent work and better rights, better enabling rights for workers. Here I argue that in most global value chains, there is a continuum between downgrading and upgrading. At one end, what I call the low road, many suppliers who are really subservient to the large buyers produce low value activities or products at low prices, high volume. These are really the suppliers that are under the downgrading pressure. They produce at low cost. They do this by employing cheap labour on low wages, very much using what I call disposable and others have called disposable women's skills, where you just turn women over and if workers burn out, you bring in more highly exploitative conditions, usually poverty wages. Usually those workers lack organisation. If they try to organise, they'll be quickly sacked. And here you find very high levels of gender inequality. But at the other end of the continuum, you also find more innovative companies who have been able to go for higher level activities, higher value activities. They've been able to find a niche, be able to produce higher quality goods. They do this through innovation, through lean production, and often through higher productivity. And it's the higher productivity that allows higher levels of profitability without pushing down wages to poverty levels. To attain the higher productivity, they have to promote both tangible and intangible skills and invest in those skills for their workers. Once you invest, you have to attract and you want to retain those workers, the better workers. You do that through better work, through decent work, through promoting more well-being, potentially through paying a living wage, although there are arguments about whether or not, in reality, even increased monetary wages translate into a living wage. Often workers are more able to be organised in suppliers and in firms which have upgraded, and there's at least the potential for greater gender equality, for more women to have greater opportunities and be able to move up within those companies. Just as some examples, the downgrading is really a good example of downgrading is found in ready-made garments. In ready-made garments, Bangladesh is one of the largest garment exporters in the world. There's been many years of very serious poor labour conditions in the Bangladesh garment sector, very high levels of female employment, somewhere around 60% of the 4 million workers at the moment are female. Women were brought into the garment sector largely because they were viewed as docile, less likely to resist, more easily thrown out, brought in. And there's relatively low productivity, particularly at the lower end of the garment production. But, and there's an important but, there is increasing contestation within the Bangladesh garment industry by workers, and that includes participation by women workers themselves. Now, obviously, one of the biggest triggers for this, or an important trigger, was the horrendous situation following the collapse of Rana Plaza, which really highlighted the lack of safety and the poor conditions and the pressures that were on garment workers. But also there have been quite long-running campaigns in Bangladesh for improvement in the minimum wage closer to a living wage. And there's certainly been some gains there just in terms of the government increasing the legal minimum wage for garment workers. So therefore, despite the downgrading trends, contestation has been an important dimension of the garment sector. An example of upgrading is in flowers. Kenya flowers is one example where I've done research. And it's really important to remember that in the flower sector, especially in the 2000s, there were enormous campaigns, media campaigns around poor conditions, the insecurity of work, very bad health and safety, especially for women being forced into greenhouses and exposed to chemicals, and also very serious issues around sexual harassment of workers. Gender-based violence is increasingly recognised as an issue in value chains. But those struggles in the 2000s led to quite a number of improvements for workers, particularly increased permanent contracts, more secure contracts, more women supervisors, women moving up even into managerial positions. This was also helped by Kenyan flowers moving into the production of bouquets, upgrading into more higher value bouquets, which required more skilled workers, needing to retain those workers, invest in those workers. And despite problems, and there are problems, women are now better organised. There are gender committees on many farms, they have better voice, and they've experienced improvements. But one question mark still being over whether they get a living wage. But we shouldn't forget that upgrading can also be done through innovation and investment in automation. And of course, the risk of automation, particularly for women workers, is that they will be displaced by machines, that you will see a shift back in terms of the gender ratio with a larger percentage of male workers, and that could lead to serious problems in the future for those upgrading trends. And that's certainly something that coronavirus is potentially could drive in the future as companies strive to withstand the shock of coronavirus. So thinking a bit more about COVID and the implications of COVID-19 for workers, let's first think about the more pessimistic trends that this could certainly lead to. Now, we've all seen how COVID led to serious value chain disruption I don't think there could be anyone in any country that didn't see a shortage of goods, stockpiling of goods, problems of people having to queue up in order to get goods, etc. And that disruption was partly through the actual closure of stores and governments who have flailed around to try and deal with the situation, not having proper coordinated responses in any way. But also that disruption occurred because of the whole just-in-time nature of value chains and the holding up of logistics, containers, etc., so that goods couldn't be moved as rapidly and as quickly and as easily as they were before, or workers. Now, despite a lot on the disruption to value chains, there hasn't been a lot of analysis of the implications for women workers, particularly in value chains, who work in value chains. The ILO has recently released data which shows that women workers overall, across all sectors and all types of activity, are disproportionately affected relative to men, because women are more concentrated in activities that have been particularly badly affected by coronavirus. But exactly how that will plays through in relation to value chains, there's less information. The research I've been involved in has largely been based on desk-based research and online interviews because of inability to do field work at present. But what we've seen from secondary data and information, as what backed up by interviews, is that really the impacts vary by different dimensions. Firstly, the type of value chain, and I've already used garments and food as examples. Garments were really badly affected by the impact of coronavirus. They were affected early because China is a major textile producer. The textiles were not going out of China, being produced or being exported out of China from January even. And so there was a very early knock-on effect. But when the COVID really hit the North American and European markets around early March, then the big retail lockdown led to closure of shops. The big garment retailers and buyers, many of them reneged on their orders, cited force majeure. Some refused to even make payments for goods that were already produced and in shipment. And that led to factory closures, workers being pushed out, and serious problems, particularly for migrant workers who were being forced back into their villages. And of course, the majority of those workers are female, so women in particular were affected by that. But we saw a very different outcome in food, because food in most countries, both the retail and production of food, was classed as essential. Not, though, of course, food services, which feeds through to restaurants and cafes. So there were still some mixed outcomes in food, some shifting from food services through to food retail. But nevertheless, there was a lot of disruption in food. That was particularly because of issues around health and safety, the need for social distancing of food workers. The majority of food workers, especially in processing and packaging, are women in most countries. And when they had to cut down on the number of workers on site at any one time, they would also cut the income of those workers. So there were still a number of adverse effects. Migrant workers couldn't get to the production sites, transport issues. So women workers were nevertheless quite badly affected in food, but certainly not as severely as garments. But it also impacts vary by the tier of the value chain. The large-scale suppliers in value chains, particularly in value chains where there's a high level of social compliance, codes of conduct, those that are regularly audited, wage workers in those large commercial sites were more likely, or are more likely, to have regular contracts, to have social insurance, and to other forms of job protection which were able to help them. But even on the large scale sites, the casual workers, the use of casual workers being brought in through third-party labour contractors, and temporary and seasonal workers are more likely to be women than men. And they didn't have the same sort of protection that the more permanent and regular workers were able to have. And then we've got examples of that across different countries and different sectors. But the small scale producers, the lower tiers of the value chain, here there was much greater impact. Informal workers, home-based workers, small scale farmers, and particularly contributing family labour, which is predominantly female, they had very little protection and were adversely affected in much more than more protected wage workers, permanent workers, especially at the upper tiers. And again, there's a sort of gender bias as you go down the value chain as to who has the least protection. It's primarily women. But it also varies a lot by country and the government responses and policies. Those governments that had a better social protection in place were able to give better protection to workers. But again, those workers who had already got in the formal sector that were already covered by contracts, social insurance, etc., were more likely to get access to that than those in the insecure work, who were primarily women. So you can see gender impacts at different tiers, at different levels. And so really what the coronavirus has done is to expose the systemic gender inequalities that operate in global value chains, where risk and cost is constantly pushed downwards. The big suppliers push those risks and costs onto subcontracted, smaller suppliers, and onto workers. And the majority of the more vulnerable and insecure workers are women, and they are the ones with the least protection. So although women are essential workers in global value chains, without them the value chains would collapse, they have also been, I would argue, more adversely affected than men, who tend to be more concentrated in the more senior jobs, in the more permanent jobs, etc. And there's a real serious issue now that we need to look at and consider, which is the economic crisis. And this is the phase that we're really moving into big time as the health crisis begins at least to be addressed. The economic crisis could be very deep and profound. Will that lead to a real reversal of any gender gains which were made over the last 20 to 30 years, including, I would say, to some extent within global value chains? So going forwards, so let's just think a little bit about where we're going now in terms of the future and what the implications are for workers. And this is more speculative. Firstly, I think very importantly is that there's a number of studies which are showing that COVID is really going to affect the way in which global value chains are structured. There will be a restructuring of value chains, and that restructuring will take different forms. It will lead to what's called just in case rather than just in time value chains. Companies know they need to have retailers, especially that they need to hold at least some stocks, emergency stocks, in the case of major shocks occurring. But also it's quite likely that it'll lead to a concentration of suppliers, of potentially more efficient suppliers who have better resources and resilience themselves, but, a very big but, a more regionalisation, so that companies and retailers are less dependent on sourcing across continents and can structure their sourcing within regions where they have greater control over supply. There is also potentially in this restructuring more automation in order to be less dependent on the movement of workers. and also to raise productivity, and also, of course, a big growth in online retailing that is already occurring. But in this debate of the restructuring might lead, and could well lead, and certainly the crisis will lead to pressures in terms of downgrading, economic and social downgrading. But there are also a number of voices, and those are in the policy world, as well as in within companies, within the private sector, and within civil society, the International Trade Union Congress, for example, who really arguing that in this process there needs to be what's called building back better, i.e. creating more resilient value chains that would be better able to resist shocks that are likely to occur, including climate change, and recur in the future. Now, the first is what, and there are many different proposals in these debates, but one that is certainly emerging is a proposal for a new social contract. And this new social contract should involve a greater alliance between private sector, public, and social. In other words, and that this should be based on achieving fairer and more equitable value chains. The private contribution to these alliances, this alliance or this new social contract, would be the guaranteeing of decent work for all. Governments should provide better policies, more effective policies, better taxation as well would be very important, to fund better social protection, so that in the event of any shock, they are better equipped to support workers. And social, very important, because civil society organisations need to play a key role in the social contract and the social cohesion of any future outcome in terms of economic and social resilience. But key in this is going to be women's voice. And one of the things that I think in the studies that I've looked at was very important, there's been insufficient discussion of the gender impacts of COVID and the essential role of women should play in this process. Now, the how, I think, is also very important, because in my view, I don't think we're going to get a new social contract automatically or simply by leaving the commercial dynamics to play out for themselves. Global value chains specifically are really driven by a financialization model that drives the extraction of value. The only way workers, civil society, and other actors linked to value chains have seen gains has been through contestation. Contestation has been a critical part, and that contestation needs to be local, it needs to be national, and it needs to be global. But in terms of what I would advocate, gender equality is absolutely critical to this. Given the role, the essential role women workers play, you're not going to get better value, more resilient value chains without it. So just concluding reflections, I think that one level I'm traditionally fairly optimistic. I've seen a lot of change over the last 20 to 30 years. I think there have been many improvements for women workers, but I think there's also plenty of room for pessimism, that the economic depression that we're likely to face is going to really drive downgrading trends which we know exist within global value chains. And quite frankly, I think what we're likely to see is a combination of both periods of down and periods when they'll be pushing for improvements. Coronavirus is really a major challenge that cannot be overlooked. But we also have to remember the role of value chains in providing leverage in terms of using some of, particularly the more innovative companies, some of whom are definitely talking about the need for building back better, who are talking about the need for greater social and economic resilience, and who are going to be promoting upgrading as part of their strategies. So leverage them in order to promote better value chain outcomes. But from the gender equality side, advancing gender equality has never been automatic. Certainly it's not being voiced enough, I think, at the moment as a key part of this debate. It's always been achieved through contestation and through challenging, and ultimately that contestation and bargaining and challenging needs to confront some of the most powerful companies and governments who collude with those companies in order to maximise value extraction, largely at the expense of unremunerated, under-recognised women workers. And therefore, really what we need is systemic change for much more fairer, more equitable value chains and societies. That is going to be the big challenge that we need to have in the future. But if we don't start that discussion, and if we don't start to drive that change, we won't succeed ever in attaining it. So thank you very much for listening to me, and I look forward to some interesting discussion about the potential for change in the future.
Thank you very much, Stephanie, for the very thoughtful and extremely inspiring lecture. In your concluding remarks, you mentioned that the current health crisis will have a significant impact on the restructuring of global value chains, maybe making them more resilient and hopefully leading to a new social contract with fairer and more equitable conditions for women in general. Although you raised attention to the negative impacts of COVID and the even more detrimental influence of the post-COVID economic crisis that could reverse the gender gains for the next 20 or even 30 years, what I will take away is your positive and optimistic message that by challenging companies and governments, we can fight for and achieve systematic change, or systemic change, as you put it. Now I would like to open the floor for questions. If you haven't asked your question, then please post it in the Q&A box. We will have 15 minutes for discussion, so I will not waste any more time, but I will ask Stephanie the first question. So the first question is from Timothy J. Sturgeon. He says, Stephanie, I love your book. And the question is, are the features of upgrading and downgrading as mutually exclusive as you present them to be? For example, many high performance or high road work practices can be very stressful with very low levels of autonomy and high levels of monitoring. Also, there is little or no requirement that firms pay workers in these high road production environments higher wages. So I would argue that lean production, when divorced from Japan's institutional setting for permanent male workers in flagship firms, has often led to downgrading in terms of labor exploitation and job loss in other parts of the world. Think of the elimination of warehouse workers in just-in-time settings. So my suggestion could be to split the features of work apart from outcomes for workers, shown in italics in your slide. So let's start with that question and then we move on, and I'm happy to collect a few more in the meantime. Thank you.
And thank you very much. Just responding to Tim's question, a very good one. And Tim, I know you work a lot on lean production especially, and I think it's an important question. I don't forget, a lot of my own research is on the labour intensive sectors, particularly food, garments. So I see the other side of value chains more on the labour intensive side than the more capital intensive side. But where I've done work on the more capital intensive side, and especially where automation is being introduced into both food production and into garment production, the sobots and the robots, you do get, and that goes with your specific focus on lean production, which are the kind of different work methods which a number of companies have introduced, led by the Japanese, but many and many others are engaged in trying to promote lean production, where you get these highly intensive production processes. And I think one of the main things you raise there is the issue of stress, and I think that is a serious issue. Certainly automation could well only enhance that and put greater pressure. I'll go on to the issue about pay I'll link up to the issue of pay. And I think we're in the sectors where I've looked, you have seen increases in nominal wages. The issue is whether those nominal wages are genuine increase in terms of real wages, because often the gains that are made are outstripped by rises in inflation, by rising rents. Bangladesh, a infamous issue is as soon as the legal minimum wage is put up, landlords put up rents to match it. So the gains that get made in one place are rapidly lost in another. And I think you mentioned the institutional context of Japan, but I think ultimately also it's this issue of contestation, worker organisation and contestation, that it's only ultimately when workers organise, as they have historically in Europe and in North America, and they are beginning to do in Asia and hopefully in Africa and Latin America, that's when you begin to see the gains, but they're not going to be automatic, and there are a lot of problems. I've presented it in a very binary way, I agree, but you have to reduce the presentation to something that's slightly simplistic.
Perfect, thank you so much.
That question relates to logistics, so I'm happy to, I don't know if you want to.
Caroline's question?
Yes.
Okay, yeah, I thought we could move on to that. So Caroline Ruiner says, excellent presentation. It is interesting that women workers are not very present in other parts of global value chains, such as logistics, also in warehouse logistics. This is mainly male dominated, at least in Germany. Moreover, in these contexts, there is a labor shortage, which would be a good basis for negotiating better working conditions for male and female workers. How could this be used to improve work in global value chains?
Yeah, so just to, this overlaps slightly with Tim's, but what's really interesting when you go across the whole of the value chain, the one place where you do women have just not got a grip, and that is in the logistics sector. So logistics, which is it's all the behind the scenes that goes on that gets your just-in-time good from production from field to fork, as they call it. Is predominantly male dominated, but what I haven't mentioned in there is services, which are also critical, all the design and the financial services, etc., that goes, often those are majority female. So when you iron it all out, that women do have an important role to play. But I think one of the key issues in terms of the optimistic side, which I didn't bring out, is this skills shortage, because if you want to innovate and if you want to present yourself as a company that is ethical and environmentally good and socially good, then you actually do need quite skilled labour, skilled workers. And the Kenya Flowers example, this didn't just come about through contestation, it also came about because they needed more skilled workers. Put the two together and then you began to get gains. So I think the skills shortage is potentially another leverage point, which hopefully will help, but very difficult to see how that will play out in a coronavirus situation where you've got hundreds of millions of jobs going to be lost, according to the ILO. So it is a very worrying context.
Okay. Do you have a preference in terms of questions? Because we've got like 7 minutes left. So I'll just read out a few more and then you can answer. So Anne's Cork asks you, can you mention some innovative companies that are trying to do it better at this time and age? And if you want, I can read out a few more and then you can just answer.
Well, just on the companies, I'm not a campaigner. I work a lot, collaborate a lot with NGOs and with trade unions, but I'm not a campaigner, I'm a researcher. I provide the information which everybody can use, be they companies, be they whoever they are. There are some companies who do stand out. I think companies such as H&M, for example, they certainly go with all the commercial pressures, but they have been a company that has put itself forward in certainly the Bangladesh situation. It's been one of the leaders. You can still criticize. Unilever on the food side is another company, which again, you can make a lot of criticisms of, but they've worked very closely with Oxfam, and they have begun to address a number of the issues. And both are companies that are promoting a sort of building back better agenda. I think I'll leave it there for the moment because there are always pros and cons. Yeah, you choose. There are quite a number of questions.
Yeah, there are a lot of questions, so I will have to be a little bit selective. But Jackie O'Reilly asks you, well, she says, thank you for the really brilliant lecture. What would you suggest are actions that we as academics and consumers, and in some case employers, can do to address some of the issues you've raised?
Yeah, and I think one of the big things, and certainly in the research I'm involved with in the David Wow program, is really, and it's a tricky one, and it's something we're currently working on, which is if women's work in global value chains is under remunerated and in some cases unremunerated. And it's how to factor in a remuneration or better remuneration for that work without then forcing women out. So I can't go into detail, but I think that's a critical issue, and we are working with two companies where we're specifically looking at that, looking at the commercial operation of the value chain and how to factor it in. But if you think about the amount of money they spend on marketing, which can be millions and millions and millions, a small correction in order to remunerate work that was done in producing the goods originally is not going to wipe their profits out. So I don't see that as transformative, but I do see it, or a systemic change, but I do see it as a big step forward if we can move in that direction. Hopefully coronavirus won't block it.
Thank you. So the next question is from Sarah Ashwin. Stephanie, I loved your book too. Thanks for the great talk. Could you say more about the ways in which the boundaries between productive and reproductive work are blurred in global value chains? I find it a fascinating concept, but would like more examples.
Yes, I think, I mean, from a purely practical side, I mean, where the obvious place where they're blurred is in small scale agriculture, and particularly for Africa, for food products, a lot is still produced in small scale agriculture. We don't see it because we see it coming through from the big processors and the big pack houses, but the food itself, the original food, has come in. And there you see a very clear blurring because women are simultaneously doing the washing, looking after the children, and producing the beans or the cocoa or the coffee or whichever. So there you can actually see a physical blurring. I think also the blurring is just the flexibility, this movement in and out. So there's the employers use this idea that women are, it's secondary work, even though many, many, many households are totally dependent on the income that comes from that women's work. But they use that societal norm to say, well, it's perfectly okay, the coronavirus, you can go home now. You know, you've got a home to go to. You have, that household will be starving because your income is now no longer coming in. So I think there's a sort of, the whole flexible labour has also helped to blur the boundaries. And also, of course, a lot of women workers in value chains, even at the lower tiers in Africa and Asia, etc., buy goods from supermarkets in order to maintain their own ability to work. So it operates in a sort of multiple dimensions.
Thank you. I think there's a related question from Tim Bartley. What factors outside of global value chains do you think will be the most important in shaping women's position in different types of global value chains in the coming decade? For instance, how family life, childcare and education get reconfigured could seemingly matter in some locations and industries. Changes in domestic politics could also shape labour force participation and women's movements.
Yeah, no, and I think that's complex, and I think that's thinking forward, and that's thinking forward almost beyond coronavirus, because I mean, certainly there's going to be a massive shock now, I think, over the next 4 or 5 years, depending on the assumption that there's a health solution. Even with that, there would be a massive shock. Worse if we don't get a health solution. But I think there are some bigger trends taking place. Certainly education has been a very important factor. Education of girls. I mean, if you take Bangladesh, a lot of the younger workers coming in, female workers, have a much higher level of literacy than their parents, their mothers did 10 or 20 years ago when they first entered in. And they're much better able to organise, they're much more aware, they're much more confident as a result. So I think that's a factor. Certainly changes in demographics will be a factor. There's an interesting report that's just come out on that. I haven't really thought through the implications. But I think going back, that issue of the skills and the potentially the recognition of the unpaid work that women do. But what we really need is a societal shift so that men and women undertake the unpaid work, the reproductive roles, as well as the paid work. And then we would have a much more gender equitable, but I certainly think suppliers, and some do give much more consideration to supporting women workers in their other roles.
Okay, thank you very much. I think this was a perfect ending because unfortunately we came to the end of our hour of discussion. So thank you very much again, Stephanie, for taking this lecture. And I would like to invite all the participants to join us on our Women and Gender Forum cocktail right after this session. You can click on the program in the featured panels right after this lecture. There is a link to the cocktail of the Women and Gender Forum where we could maybe continue the discussion in a more informal way. So
thank you, Dori, and to SASE for the invitation. It's been a great pleasure.
Thank you so much, Stephanie. It was a real pleasure to have you here, and I think we had a really good discussion. We didn't have much time for questions, but I think we had some really good questions. Thank you so much for your time. See you all in the cocktails in a few minutes, so grab a drink. Thank you so much. Bye.
Bye.